Well, welcome everyone to another lecture by CSGI, the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual. Very happy to have a guest speaker here today that I'm going to let one of my colleagues introduce, but I just want to say a couple things about CSGI. CSGI exists to study the constitutional, economic, and political foundations of a free and flourishing society. And as part of that mission, we regularly host lectures such as tonight's, which talk about enduring principles in our constitutional order, also the norms and virtues of a self-governing citizenry. And today I think that we're certainly right there with that idea of enduring principles and civic virtue. And I want to just take a brief moment to sort of promote something that we're doing with CSGI that's a little bit new. In about a year's time, a year and a half's time, we're putting on a conference called the Colorado Conference on Civic Discourse. And it's meant to sort of launch a new initiative on civic discourse through CSGI, where we really want to focus on both the civics education and also the sort of deliberative norms that we need to have as a free citizenry to really flourish into maybe, as we all know, better some of our social and public discourse. And so that's an exciting new initiative that we're starting to get going, and I think that this lecture is a fantastic sort of introduction to that, to talk about a very, very important social norm and civic virtue, and that is of civility. So, and I'm very excited for our speaker, but I also want to take this opportunity to introduce you all to a new faculty member. His name is Josh Vandiver. He's come to us from Ball State University in Indiana. He did his graduate work at Princeton University and teaches and researches on political theory, constitutional law. He's also big on extremist movements. He likes to talk about the exciting stuff. But he's been a really great addition to the political science department here at UCCS and also CSGI. So please welcome Josh, who will then introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. And welcome everybody. It's great to see this turnout for my dear friend Lexi Hudson. This is a celebration of her book, her new book, The Soul of Civility, which you can purchase with the aid of this QR code here. We have a couple copies you can look at if you'd like to have a look at what it includes. She'll be talking today about civility. You can also find the book on the event page that you probably saw in order to get here to this event. A little bit about Lexi and a little bit about how I met Lexi. So born in LA, raised in Vancouver, went to Trinity Western and then to the London School of Economics. Along the way, studied some great thinkers. Plato, Augustine, Pascal, Hobbes, and Nietzsche. So I had this beautiful education in the great books. At those institutions, and maybe despite those institutions in certain ways as well. We learned at the lunch today with our Bastiat scholars. She also picked up an incredible husband along the way. So the first time I met was 2017, met both of them. We were at a small conference on the role of the state in education. Lexi was at that time working for the US Department of Education, but had done all the readings for the conference, which nobody does, and was incredibly learned and thoughtful and kind and charismatic, and really stole the show, I think, at that conference back in 2017. So I'm glad we've been able to stay in touch. My spouse and I lived in Indianapolis last year, and Lexi and her husband took us in, hosted us at their home, despite just 2-3 months before having suffered this catastrophic water main break that had destroyed their main home. So we were visiting them at another small home nearby. It just goes to show that hospitality never stops, that despite these hardships that they were facing, and 2 kids that they'd had in the meantime, they were there, and the parents were there, all this stuff, they still invited us over for dinner. We had a wonderful time talking about her book and just celebrating being together there in Indianapolis, the crossroads of America, where Lexi lives now. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to her to talk about her book, The Soul of Civility, about the need for civility. But as Steve mentioned, as someone that researches extremism, I I hope for my sake, for my job's sake, that you're not too successful, Lexi, in spreading the word about civility. Turn it over to Lexi Hudson.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Everyone in the back can hear me? Excellent. It's such a pleasure to be with you here in Colorado Springs. Today, I was saying that I got off the airplane this morning and was kind of in a daze. I had a very early flight from Miami this morning, and I'm just kind of like meandering outside the airport, just trying to get to where I need to go. And I looked to my right, and I'm just aghast by the vista that greets me, the mountains and just the panoramic views. It's just magnificent, and I know that you know how privileged you are to enjoy this. The dozen or so people I've spoken to just since I've been here, I got in a few hours ago, every single one of you has said how majestic that this view is, and you don't take it for granted. And I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, as Josh says, so we had the oceans and the mountains, and just those vistas are something that I so miss, and they're such an important antidote to just the emotional, we're all running on empty emotionally a little bit. I'll talk about that at the end, why beauty and the sublime that we have the opportunity to enjoy here every day here in Colorado Springs is such an important antidote to these harried and chaotic days that we find ourselves in. We'll talk about that at the end, but thank you so much for having me. As Josh said, I am from LA, grew up in Vancouver, Canada. I'm a lifelong lover of ideas and learning. I'm passionate about the way that ideas and storytelling can change people's lives for the better. I care deeply about the intersection of ideas and practice, how ideas can enhance how we live our lives and flourish in relationship with others. I came to my interest in this topic on manners and social norms honestly. My mother is called, get this, Judy the Manners Lady. As I was writing this book, I actually discovered that my mother is one of 4 women who are internationally renowned experts on manners and etiquette, named Judy. There are 4 of them. Maybe it was a generational thing. Judy Garland, I think, was prominent during the Wizard of Oz launch, but there are 4 internationally renowned experts on manners named Judy. The most famous is probably Judith Martin, the longtime Washington Post columnist who goes by the monkier Miss Manners, but there are 3 others. My mother is my favorite, Judith's of the courtesy biz, and so she raised my brothers and I to mind our P's and Q's, and she showed us how to set the table just so, and this won't surprise Josh, but I am constitutionally allergic to authority. I hate rules, I hate being told what to do, so growing up I would ask my mother, why are we doing this? What is this? What is the purpose of this exercise? Like, why do forks go here, knives go here? Why are we using forks and knives at all when other cultures use their hands and others still use chopsticks? Is there anything morally superior to how we do things? And my mother, frustrated with me, would say, this is just the way we do them. Just do this thing that I'm asking you to do. And these questions always linger in my mind. I hunger for a moral and philosophical underpinning for why we do things the way we do them. Is it just because some self-appointed authority at some time in history had decided that we should do it this way? And is that a sufficient justification to continue doing things the way that we do them? So I always had these why questions in my mind. And in addition to teaching us the ways and means of politeness, my mother modeled for us true civility and hospitality, which is a high and noble expression of civility. Our home growing up was a revolving door of newcomers to our community, homestays from across the globe. And my mother is just passionate about the human social project and transforming the outsider to the insider, the stranger into the friend. I'm so grateful to have had her example, and I'm grateful to her this very moment for watching my kids so I could be here with you today right now, but just really grateful to her for that. Despite always questioning the rules of etiquette and propriety my mother had instructed us to abide by, I generally followed them. My mother promised that they would lead to success in work and school and life, and she was right. Until I found myself at the United States Department of Education. I was in federal government for 1 year, 2017 to 2018, a notoriously divided time in our world in our country, in our nation's capital. And my experience in government was a microcosm of the division and fractured nature of our country as a whole. While I was in government, I experienced and witnessed these two extremes. On one hand, there were people who had sharp elbows. They were bellicose, aggressive. They were hostile. They were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. And I knew to stay away from those people. On the other hand, there was this other contingent. They were polished and poised and polite. At first, I thought these were my people. But these are the people who would smile and flatter at me and others one moment, and then stab us in the back the next. And this second contingent deeply perplexed me, because one thing my mother had said to me growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward expression of our inward character. And yet here I was surrounded by people who were well-mannered enough, and yet ruthless and cruel. There was this profound mismatch between manners, morals, etiquette, and ethics. This experience highlighted several things for me. First, these two extremes, the extreme hostility and the extreme politeness, those really define two extremes in our public life today. And often people think that embracing one is an antidote to the other. So for example, to puncture the culture of pretense and hypocrisy and politeness, people feel like they have to bully, to steamroll, to tell hard truths and confront others. Or to, in an attempt to ameliorate the hostility and bellicosity in our public life, they just want to talk nicely to one another, just be nicer and more polite. And yet what I realized is that while these seem like polar opposites, these two extremes are actually very similar. They're two sides of the same coin. Both modes insufficiently appreciate the gift of being human. Both modes see other human beings as means to their selfish ends, as opposed to ends in themselves, beings in themselves who are worthy of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. The hostile contingent sees others as pawns to be steamrolled and bowled over in order to obtain their objectives. The polite contingent sees others as pawns to be manipulated in order to get what they want. But both insufficiently see others as ends themselves worthy of a bare minimum of respect by virtue of our shared moral status as human beings and as citizens in this democracy. This experience also clarified for me that there is an essential distinction between civility and politeness. I realized that politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's external, it's technique, whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart, an orientation to others, a way of seeing them as our moral equals, who are worthy of a bare minimum of respect by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And that crucially, sometimes actually respecting someone, actually loving someone, requires being impolite. It requires telling hard truths, engaging in robust debate. That's a duty of citizenship and a way to actually love and respect others. And what we need today, I realized, is less politeness, less appearing good and appearing respectful, and more civility, more actually being so, even if it risks offending someone, hurting someone's feelings. That's what we need to, especially in a democracy, and especially in this divided moment where there are so many pressing conversations that need to be had. I love etymology. The story and the origin and history of language is throughout my book, and the etymology of these words supports this distinction I made between civility and politeness. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Samuel Johnson before. Samuel Johnson, good. Quarter of the room maybe. So Samuel Johnson wrote the first English dictionary in 1755. And he set out this great task of defining the world And as he was defining the world, if you go to his dictionary today, as he defined the English language, he defines civility in terms of politeness, politeness in terms of civility. So since the first English dictionary, we've been defining these words in light of one another, and we've been doing it ever since. And today, we hear cries from across the political aisle of people who either they want more civility and they hearken and politeness, and they hearken back to this golden age of gentility and chivalry and equality amongst our public leaders and citizens alike across divisions. And they said, if we can just get back to that golden era and revive civility and politeness, we'll be okay. And then there's another contingent that says, no, civility and politeness are part of the problem. They are a tool of the patriarchy, of people in positions of power, to keep the powerless powerless, to silence, to oppress. We need less civility and politeness in public life. And yet what both these voices miss is this essential distinction between civility and politeness that I make throughout the book. The etymology, again, supports that the etymology of politeness is polere, the Latin word polere, which means to smooth or to polish. And that's what politeness does. It's superficial, it's external, and it attempts to diminish difference, sweep difference under the rug, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. The Latin root of civility is civitas, which is the Latin root, which is the etymological root for all of our words: citizen, citizenship, city, civilization. That civility is the conduct, the habits, the mores, the duties befitting a citizen in a civilized society, in the city, that especially in a democracy like our own, requires debate, requires robust, spirited conversation about competing visions and means to pursuing the good. Too often today we settle for politeness, and we should aim instead for true civility. My book is about the most important question of our day, which is how do we flourish across deep difference? And what does it look like in practice in our own moment? This is exactly the question I asked myself after I left government, after that very divided season. And I zoomed out and asked big questions again. What does it mean to be human? And what is the bare minimum of respect that we are owed and will owe to others by virtue of our shared humanity? And that was the kind of moral and philosophical basis that I constructed this philosophy of civility. And what I realized while I wrote this book is that while this is the most important question of our day, this is not a new question, not a new problem. This is the defining problem of democracy. How do we peacefully coexist despite our differences? This is the defining question of the classical liberal project. How do we exist amid pluralism, a pluralistic society? This is the defining question, in fact, of the human species. As long as we've been around, we've been trying to do this thing called life together with others. We are doggedly social as a species, socially resilient. We always try to come together in groups, in friendship, in order to increase our chances of survival and flourishing. We become fully human. We become our best selves in relationship with others. And yet, morally and biologically, we're defined by self-love. We're geared to meet our own needs before others, and those two facets of who we are, the love of others and the love of self, are in tension. And that is why this thing called life together, friendship, community, democracy, civilization itself, is always fragile. It is never a foregone conclusion. And in fact, depends on our daily decisions to sacrifice our immediate desires for the sake of living well with others. Just as timeless as the problem, though, is the solution. And the solution is civility. The act of restraining the self for the sake of community and achieving and allowing that social aspect of who we are to flourish and thrive. I loved surveying this genre of etiquette manuals across history, across culture. And there's a remarkable consensus, a remarkable continuity in this body of literature and wisdom. Thoughtful people across time and place have independently observed the human condition and come to similar ideas about how to do this thing called life together. And they all pivot around this idea of restraint for the self, so the social can flourish, the social at the individual level and the societal level can flourish. Did you know, for example, that the oldest book in the world is a civility book, given to us from ancient Egypt over 4,000 years ago? Ptahhotep was an advisor to the pharaoh, and he was a man who had reached the pinnacle of worldly, temporal, earthly success, political success. He had been in the room where it happens his entire life. And he was even offered the opportunity to become pharaoh. He turned that down in order to lead a quiet life in retirement. And while he was in retirement, he put pen to paper and thought deeply about the timeless principles of human flourishing. And how do we do this thing called life together? And he wrote down 37 maxims intended as a gift to Pharaoh's son in hopes that it might empower him to be a wise and just ruler when he became pharaoh. And Ptahhotep's maxims, you might find it funny to learn, could appear in a Judith Martin Miss Manners column today in the Washington Post. It's conventional wisdom that we're all familiar with, like, don't abuse a power differential. Don't be cruel to people who are vulnerable or who you have authority over. Be gentle to the vulnerable in society. Ptahhotep says, don't be good to your friends or your neighbors just when you need something. Be good, gracious, generous to them all the time. He says in several maxims, do not gossip or slander, all too appropriate in the age of social media and viral scandalous rumors being spread at a moment's notice. I also love the insights from another scholar and author in this civility genre, Erasmus of Rotterdam. Raise your hand. Has anyone in this room heard of Erasmus of Rotterdam before? A few of you. Well, I'm glad to share with you the story of Erasmus of Rotterdam. He's one of my favorite figures from intellectual history. He was a superstar of the European Renaissance, originally from the Netherlands. He left when he was very young and never spent more than 2 years in any place for the remainder of his life. He lived this peripatetic life of a scholar. He was the most coveted dinner party guest in all of Europe and just spent his life traveling from court to court, kingdom to kingdom, as a tutor of princes and just the companion of other geniuses, scholars, and wealthy people. And he was a genius, but also kind and just witty and fun and gregarious and passionate about the human social project. He is famous, most famous for a Greek translation of the New Testament, but I like to popularize him for his civility literature. Apparently one day he was walking the street and he was scandalized by an ill-mannered youth. You won't find it surprising that this complaint about kids these days is nothing new. That this is often an instigator for people who write in this genre, this vein, this civility genre. They're like, I just can't take the kids these days anymore. I'm going to do something about it. And so a youth had insufficiently greeted him as he thought was appropriate. So he said, okay, I'm going to write this book. And it's the only civility book that I'm aware of that categorizes do's and don'ts by body part. There's a chapter on the hands, there's a chapter on the eyes, there's a chapter on the nose and the mouth. One of my favorite from Erasmus is, he said, he was presciently sanitary, and he said, you know, as you wash your hands, this is before germ theory, he says, as you wash your hands before dinner, so too cleanse your mind of any pollutions of the day. And I love that because it's so easy to, in this chaotic world, bring the chaos of life, of traffic, of drama, of scandal, of the frenetic things going around us into our personal lives and into our, but just to release that, you know, as we wash our hands, so mentally, you know, wash our minds as well, and come in to dinner and community with others fresh and open and receptive, not clouded and mired by the worries of the day. Erasmus, in his section on the eyes, took a puzzlingly strong stance against winking. He was not a fan. He says, leave winking, that's the purview solely of the tuna fish, not suitable for human beings. Erasmus ends his lovely book on manners called A Handbook for Civility for young children with what I think truly embodies the timeless wisdom of human flourishing and the true spirit of civility, the true soul of civility. He ends with this maxim. He says, that is so countercultural to our own moment. He says, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself. In our era that wants to blame and externalize the causes of division, brokenness, and problems in our world, Erasmus totally inverts that. Says, forget others, readily forgive them, and focus on yourself. How can you be better in your everyday? What is your role, your responsibility in this joint project of living well with others? It's hard to really conceive what this ethic of true civility looks like. We don't really have a lot of contemporary public leaders that embody this spirit of civility. And that's hard, but thankfully, history brims with true heroes of true civility. One of my favorite is the story of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the life story, the remarkable life story of William Penn. Just a handful of you, love that. William Penn was born to a very privileged family. His father was a very politically connected member of the aristocracy, that very close with the King of England, and he was an admiral, very high up in the English Navy. Very worldly, very sophisticated. He wanted nothing but the best, the very best for his son. He, private tutors his whole life, every advantage he could think of. Sent his son to Oxford, where unfortunately things went amiss. William Penn converted to Quakerism at Oxford. And Quakerism was kind of seen as this fanatical brand of religion of the day. And the admiral would not have been as concerned with this spiritual fanaticism if it didn't have real practical implications for how William Penn lived his life. But this is the story of how William Penn shared with his father that he was a Quaker. The story goes that one day he came home from Oxford and stepped into the hall and said hi to his father, and he did not remove his hat to his father. And at first, we get this story from Denis Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, as this crowning achievement of the French Enlightenment. They tell us this story. They say, at first the admiral thought his son had gone mad, and then realized he had just become a Quaker. And Quakerism had this radical egalitarianism, that all were equal in the eyes of God. And if all were equal in the eyes of God, then why am I bowing to you? Why am I tipping my hat to you? Why am I obliging these norms of the day that actually hurt you by falsely inflating your pride and your ego? It's selling you a lie, the Quakers thought. We are equal in the way that matters most. Therefore, I'm not going to treat you any differently than I would anyone else. To do so would be a lie, and that is deeply disrespectful to you. And that's why William Penn did not tip his hat or bow when he greeted his son. And this was catastrophic for the admiral, because it meant that William would never have a chance of any sort of standing or social life or life in the Navy or at all, if he wasn't going to comply with the norms, the prevailing manners and etiquette of the day. In fact, there's another story where William Penn was invited to a reception for King Charles. And Charles enters the room, and everyone in the room bends the knee, except for William Penn, who stands there. And Charles is kind of bemused and perplexed and approaches William Penn and says, doesn't say anything, and he instead does something quite remarkable. He, kind of as a joke, bows and bends the knee to him. That could have been easily a death sentence, but he took it in stride. And in fact, that's kind of a example of condescension in the original sense. The word condescending today is kind of patronizing, someone pretending to come to your standard to kind of coddle you and patronize you. But the original word use of condescension was to treat someone as your equal in a way that was actually respectful. So original use of the word condescension. The Quakers were persecuted, widely persecuted. They're these heroes of civility, but they were widely persecuted across England and America. They were thrown in jail. They were despised because to everyday Englishmen, they were just rude. In English, raise your hand if you studied a different language, German, French. So in other languages, there are two forms of the word you. There's an informal one, and there's a formal one. In French, it's tu, which is the informal, and vous, which is the formal one that you use for a stranger or a social superior or a parent. English used to have, today we just have you, we use for everyone universally, but in English we used to have that same distinction. You was the formal one, the one you would use for a social superior or a stranger, just a formal act of deference and politeness. And thou was the informal one you would use with intimates and close friends. And the Quakers went around calling everyone thou. And that drove, in addition to not tipping their hats, not doing all these gestures, bowing, and it drove everyone crazy. They were universally despised, persecuted, thrown in jail. It's interesting, an attempt to kind of civilize his son and knock Quakerism out of him. The admiral sent William Penn to the court of Louis XIV in France, the paragon, the epitome of politesse and politeness, and really politeness as a tool of keeping people so busy focusing on following the rules that they were too busy to overthrow the king. That really was the intent behind the politeness that defined these elaborate etiquette architecture at Versailles. And all of French culture is really tight and formal and rigid and polite. And one day, when William Penn was in France, he passed by someone in the street at night. And he didn't barely even notice the person, but the person took notice of him. Particularly the person took notice, the Frenchman, that William had insufficiently greeted him with due deference, and challenged him to a duel, wanted to fight him to the death. And William found a way to kind of bow out of the situation graciously without losing his life and without engaging in the fight. But he reflects on this story, this experience that he had in his memoir. It's called No Cross, No Crown. And he was absolutely scandalized by this. He said, the fact that someone was willing to take a life or be killed by virtue of a small prick to their ego that I had not even noticed him. I didn't mean to hurt his feelings. I didn't mean to ignore him. I just hadn't noticed him. And the fact that this person was willing to go through such great lengths to defend their pride, that made him double down all the more about why manners and gesticulations and are just pure flattery that puff up the ego and that don't truly respect others as our moral equals, whereas true civility does. Just kind of the basics that help us get along. So I love William Penn as a hero of true civility for our current moment, Penn and the Quakers in general. It's easy to look around us and feel helpless and hopeless. This is an intractable, a timeless problem. What can we do? We're just one person. We're just a group of people. Can anything be done at all to remedy such a timeless, intractable challenge? I'll tell you two stories from people in very different times and very different places that I think offer a path for us to be part of the solution in our own moment. Raise your hand if you've read or studied or heard of Confucius before. Good, happy to hear that, lots of hands. So it's said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. The same can be said that all of Eastern philosophy is a footnote to Confucius. He was this man who very early on in his life had big plans to change the world for the better. He was passionate about moral and social reform through education. So he studied hard, and he thought he had lots of ideas for how to make the world a better place, this idealistic, young, social reformer. And he spent 2 years of his life wandering around China, knocking on the doors of different leaders in different provinces and trying to secure a post for himself to be an advisor and a leader to a Chinese leader, an advisor to a Chinese leader. And no one would take him in. He was devastated. He thought he had so much to give, and he was frustrated that no one would just give him the opportunity to have this sort of influence and opportunity to implement his ideas of moral and social renewal in China that he thought he desperately needed. So he goes home to his home province, defeated, and he builds a little community of him and his friends. And they kind of double down. They say, we can't control whether people give us positions of power, but we're going to change ourselves, and we're going to focus on cultivating and refining the ideas of humaneness, of human kindness, of compassion, of hospitality. These are all ideas. For Confucius, life was inherently social. The social life was the good life. And so he doubled down and sought to both embody and model his own ideas of moral renewal and reform in his own life. And of course, his own ideas were codified in the work of his ideas in the Analects that have had untold positive influence on the trajectory of history. Not just East, but West as well. I encourage you to pick up the Analects sometime and to spend some time. Incredibly humane and practical and beautiful. Confucius said, I can't control what others do, but I can control myself. And he ended up having an amazing influence across world history as a result of that. So that was thousands of years ago in a different time, in a different place, but I'll tell you a story of when I left government. I came home from work one day very frustrated, and I said to my husband, I'm done with DC, I'm done with Washington, done with government. Let's move to Indiana, I said. My husband's from there originally, and I had in my mind this rolling bucolic pasture is just peaceful, and I wanted to escape the toxicity of the swamp. And my husband says to me in the evening, okay, sounds good. We'll move to Indiana. No take-backs. And a few months later, we were out there. We've been there 5, almost 6 years now. It took a little while for Indiana to feel like home. As we were talking about at lunch, community requires effort, requires cultivation. And one thing that really mattered in terms of helping Indiana feel like home for us was one particular friend. She came up to me after church one day and said, hi, I'm Joanna Taft. Would you like to porch with us sometime? And I had never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but I was curious. And we didn't know many people in town, so we went to her home that afternoon. And I realized that Joanna, from the vantage point of her front porch, is staging a quiet revolution against our atomized and divided status quo. She had curated on her front porch that day people across race, class, politics, geography, even not to have a structured, curated conversation across difference, just to inhabit a shared space and to be human beings in the eyes of others in a way that is actually quite rare these days. An undertone in my book, an undercurrent, a recurring theme is that this is not a new problem. This is a problem that emerges from a part of the human condition and the human personality that we all share. There's no single cause, no single solution. It's not going away very easily. And yet there are many things that are different about our moment. For example, social media. That's definitely something that wasn't around in the days of Erasmus or Tahotah for that matter. The profit motives of our media cycle that is rewarded by peddling the incendiary and the rage-inducing. That's profitable. Or the fact that it's very easy in modern life to not encounter people that we don't want to encounter. Virtually, we know this to be the case. We can curate our little online ecosystems and unfollow, unfriend people we don't want to hear from, but that's also the case corporally as well. In our physical lives, if we leave our houses at all in the age of digital nomadry, we go from our homes to cars to work to back again, and we can have Netflix in our home, with groceries and Seamless to Grubhub to deliver our meals, and if we don't want to, we don't have to see people that we differ from, we don't like, people we don't have in common with. And that's what's so beautiful and radical about what was happening on Joanna's porch that day. It wasn't a place where difference was assigned greater value than commonality, the reverse, where we were just people, having conversations, building trust across these divides that is so missing and so direly lost in our world right now. I realized that there are people across the country today who are doing as Joanna does, with and without a front porch, who are transforming outsiders to insiders, strangers into friends, just like I had seen my mother do so many times growing up. They're saying, I can't control who's in the White House, who's tweeting what the scandal of the day is, but I can control myself. And I'm going to choose to control what I can control and make my community better, stronger, and more beautiful. And we can too. That's what Confucius chose to do. That's what Joanna chose to do. There's great power in that. We each have way more power to either be a part of the problem of atomization and division and loneliness and despair that defines our world, or to be part of the solution. And in my mind, another core part of the solution, in addition to all of us porching more, is having more encounters with the sublime, with the beautiful. In the final chapter of my book on misplaced meaning and forgiveness, I argue that all too many people today have misplaced their meaning, their identity, in politics and public issues. As these traditional touchstones of meaning, faith, family, community, have been on the ascendant in recent decades, people have relocated their ultimate source of meaning in public life and political issues. And we're overdoing democracy and political issues, and we're undermining our democratic institutions, and in the process, and hurting our own souls as well. There are three symptoms for this that I see. One is the fact that previously apolitical venues, there's now politics there. Everything seems to have a political dimension. Politics is everywhere. What sports teams you root for, where you live, where you get your news, where you send your kids to school, all of these things have a political angle to them now. There's no neutral apolitical places anymore, it feels like. And that's, again, bad for our souls and bad for our politics, bad for our democracy. A second symptom of this misplaced meaning is that it seems like people can often go from 0 to 60 immediately. You mention one issue offhandedly that isn't exactly square with how they see the issue or see the world. And they fly off the head, they're triggered, they have this inordinate response, and that's a symptom of their meaning being threatened, their identity being threatened, and their lizard brain activated, and they're in fight or flight. And this is, again, a democracy depends on rational, deliberative discourse. And if we're not able to have that because we're all in fight or flight because our meanings and identities are constantly being threatened and aggravated, again, bad for our souls, bad for society. A third symptom I see of this misplaced meaning is the heartbreaking number of lifelong friendships and family relationships that have been severed and ended because of political difference. Because of a difference on one issue, who you voted for, your position on vaccines, that is enough for me to define the sum total of who you are and not associate with you anymore. And that is a symptom of disordered loves, of making too important things that are not as important as family and lifelong friendships. But it's not enough just to identify an addiction to politics or an idol or a a misplaced love. Nature abhors a vacuum. We have to displace it permanently with something better and more beautiful. I offer 3 ideas in my book for things that we can do to help us make politics matter less, relegate it to its proper place, and help restore our souls, replenish us, and help us do this thing called life together with others better. I talk about friendship, recovering friendship, especially across difference. I talk about curiosity, intellectual curiosity being the stuff of the good life for its own sake, but also an important tool to healing our deep divides. We live in an age of absolute moral certainty, where people feel very assured that they have all the answers, and that if you think differently, you are not just intellectually wrong, you're morally wrong. But what if we invert that and infuse a little curiosity into our public life, and instead of saying, you think this way that's differently than me, therefore you're a bad person, instead saying, I wonder, tell me more about how you came to view the world that way. Tell me about yourself and your story and how that informs how you view the world differently, because we are all so complex, infinitely, irreducibly complex. And there are many reasons that we come to our views of the world. And when we reduce people to one aspect of who they are, we degrade them, we dehumanize them. It's a cheapened simplicity that is deeply degrading. It's not fair to them. So instead, having a little curiosity and wonder how we approach others. Lastly, I talk about beauty, having a daily dose of wonder and encountering the sublime. Edmund Burke, in his lovely essay he wrote, the Irish statesman and philosopher, he wrote an essay called An Inquiry into the Nature of the Beautiful and the Sublime. And Edmund Burke says, the beautiful is something that makes you feel nice. The sublime is something altogether different. The sublime instills within you fear. When you look up at the vastness of space at night and contemplate infinity, when you encounter the ferociousness of the waves crashing on rocks during a storm, when you're at the Garden of the Gods and just contemplate the vastness and beauty of geological mysteries, that our sense of self is shrunken. We are made to feel smaller in a really important, a really humbling way. Our sense of self is shrunk and displaced, and our small, petty squabbles and concerns are put into context. The context of the infinity of the vastness of the galaxies and the cosmos and the infinite mysteries of the world. Encountering the sublime on a daily basis, like you are privileged enough to do here, being surrounded by the mountains and other natural wonders. What it does is, as Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, says, it displaces the fat, relentless ego, something we have to do day in, day out, moment by moment, every day, in order to effectively do this thing called life together with others. And thoughtful people across history and culture have known that this is exactly the practice we have to do, shrinking the self, displacing the fat, relentless ego, conquering our ego day in, day out, moment by moment, considering the needs of others alongside of ourselves, that this is the stuff of the soul of civility. And it takes effort. It's not rocket science, but it takes effort. It is a superpower, though, and it's the stuff that can heal society and ourselves, and that the more that we seek to improve ourselves, heal ourselves, and be better in our everyday, and embody these ideals in every day, that we might be able to change the world. So thank you so much, Colorado Springs, and for the Institute, Josh, and Stephen, for having me. So very grateful and thrilled to be with you, and I'd love to hear from you now about what's on your mind as it relates to civility. But thank you for having me.
We have time for a few questions Lexi's graciously going to field. The page from the Madison program at Princeton, we're going to set aside a couple of the initial questions for students. So hold back everybody else. Students first, some questions for Lexi.
If I can ask, just make sure you speak clearly and loudly, please. We are recording it, so hopefully it'll catch your voice.
Yes.
Have you previously seen or encountered before a best case or a just case for being uncivil? Have you seen it making sort of progress?
I'd say that the question is, for those that didn't hear it, when might incivility be justified? What is the greatest argument for incivility? You know, and we hear this argument a lot today, that the stakes are very high, and the other side is very bad, and we have to be willing to take the gloves off and do whatever is necessary to win, and to beat the other side. And what people insufficiently appreciate who peddle and prescribe to this reasoning is that when we are uncivil and cruel and malicious and act in dehumanizing ways to others, we don't just hurt others, we hurt ourselves too. I had a really formative experience closely reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. It was actually just the weekend after the weekend that Josh alluded to. I had two kind of back-to-back weekends that were really intellectually vibrant and challenging and stimulating while I was having my soul crushed in government that were very clarifying. And one of them was part of the curriculum for one of these was reading Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And Dr. King borrowed from Socrates as he made his own argument. Socrates said that virtue is its own reward and vice is its own punishment. The symptom of a vicious soul is acting with injustice towards others, hurting them, again, with maliciousness and cruelty. Symptoms of a virtuous soul is acting with justice towards others. And that an unjust soul was a sick soul. And whether the person who was acting with injustice towards others realized it or not, they were suffering and they were sick, and that was its own punishment. But conversely, the person who acted with justice and the virtuous soul, that's a symptom of a well-ordered, a healthy, vibrant soul, and that is its own reward, irrespective of external, instrumental outcomes or gains. And Dr. King made a similar observation about segregation. Dr. King said segregation, in his letter from Birmingham jail, is mutually harmful. It hurts both parties. It hurts both segregated and segregator. It hurts the segregated by giving them a false sense of inferiority. And it hurts the segregator by giving them a false sense of superiority. It deforms their soul. Both parties are dehumanized. They are made to be less human and less humane. But the invert, and I realize that the same is true for incivility. All acts of cruelty and malice and dehumanization towards our fellow human beings is mutually harmful. Hurts both parties, deforms both souls, makes us less human, less humane. But the inverse is also true. Acts of civility, hospitality, kindness, compassion. That is mutually ennobling. Both parties are left more human. The humanity is cultivated, but also more humane as well. So, to that very common, very prominent argument against civility, when is incivility justified? I think that those that prescribe to that insufficiently appreciate the way that incivility hurts both parties. Yes. Yes.
Thanks for your talk being here tonight. So, my question is, so a lot of those tenets of civility seem to be rooted in faith and religion, and you look at others, that kind of thing. So, is there a correlation, you think, from the Western perspective, us becoming less secular? Can you see, would that maybe tied to the levels of civility we were experiencing here in the West?
It's an interesting question. The question is the relationship between faith and civility, and as we are becoming more secular as a society, are we losing civility, basically? It's a really interesting and important question. My definition of civility is informed by my faith. It's expressly humanistic. It has a high view of humanity. My book is a humanistic manifesto about the gift of being human in these deeply divided times and what we owe the other in these deeply divided times. I ground my philosophy of civility in this concept of the imago Dei. This is a Judeo-Christian concept about God creating man in his own image, and that each human being has an infinite, irreducible value and worth, regardless of race, skin color, geography, just by virtue of being created in God's image, of being a human being. And there, as Immanuel Kant said, every human being has this transcendent kernel, this sort of spark of the divine within us, and that's where our dignity and the respect that we're deserved, that we are owed and owed to others, is rooted in that. And the reality is twofold. One, across history and culture, this hasn't been obviously abided by, right? Who you respected was very contingent. It was often people in your tribe. It was certainly not the enemy, not the other, not people in classes above or below you. It was very insular. And at the same time, though, this is an idea that is widely accepted today. It's the, dignity and the imago Dei is the kind of the philosophical foundation, the moral underpinning of human rights, which is kind of universally accepted as a given today. Of course, all human beings have rights. That the language of dignity is very intertwined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this beautiful document that came out of the atrocities of World War II, where we saw the consequences of insufficiently appreciating the unquestionable gift of being human, where we saw people rationalizing mass murders because people were on a hierarchy, right, of value and had no objective worth. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a manifesto of human dignity and personhood that is kind of unimpeachable today. Nobody questions that, even though it has roots in a theistic tradition. So to answer your question, there's a reason I draw in my book from texts across history and across culture to explore this body of human wisdom about how to do life together, independent of revelation, independent of religious persuasions, that people across times and across place have come to similar ideas about the need of restraining self for the sake of others, and that even amid a secular society, an increasingly secular society, that's still an idea that I hope has cross-cultural appeal. Yes?
Can you expand a little bit more on what particular thinkers, philosophers kind of laid a philosophical groundwork for civility and virtue that you value?
Yes. So one civility book that is often cited today is George Washington's 110 Rules of Civility. And George Washington didn't write these, he hand-scribed them. It was just a handwriting exercise that he did as part of his education that was actually copying an even older Jesuit French book on civility. And this French book on civility was borrowed from a thinker that we didn't talk about today called Giovanni della Casa. He was a scholar and kind of a social commentator during the Italian Renaissance, and he wrote this lovely book that you should all read called Il Galateo. And Il Galateo's core thesis, it's very particular. He has very specific ideas for how to do life with others that are really kind of culturally contingent and based on his particular aesthetic senses and sensibilities. But the underpinning, the kind of core idea of Il Galateo is like, to do life together, he says, just do your utmost not to be disgusting. Life together is really hard, and like the body's gross, and we're constantly doing things that we shouldn't be doing, and like just try to not. That's really the ethos. He has this great insight. He said, life together can really be like death by 1,000 paper cuts. If we're just constantly walking through life and confronted with people's thoughtlessness and callousness, like we're inclined to be like, let's just give up. Why are we even here? And so he has a really profound argument, and it's kind of a psychological argument about how the small things that we're surrounded by every day have profound psychological consequences. That even how we present ourselves to the world, he says, like, be neat, be clean, be well presentable. That is a gift that you can give to your family, to your neighbors, and not to be an eyesore at the airport or the grocery store. Like he had thoughts on that. And he says that he says that even if blows be light, if they be many, can kill, which is a great point. Death, like life together, can be like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Giovanni della Casa was a student of Aristotle, and he derived a lot of his ideas that ended up in Galateo from the Nicomachean Ethics, which has a lot of thoughts on how to interact with others. And the Greeks were unquestionably influenced by the Egyptians. It's possible that some of the Greeks in Plato, Aristotle's time might have even had access to Tahotep's maxims. We know that they were widely read within Egyptian society. We know that many Greeks traveled to Egypt and came back with different texts and ideas about the Egyptian gods, and they revered them. And so it's really fun to see the sort of intellectual lineage and dialogue between these thinkers, but also knowing full well that people have come to these ideas independently, such as Tahotep, just kind of objectively, inductively studied the human condition, studied human nature, and came to really strong thoughts on the stuff of human flourishing. So that's chapter 2 of my book. If you want to know, if you want to get a copy and know more, it's kind of the greatest hits of the civility genre from across history and culture. Yes.
So you mentioned that Latinx differs across different cultures, different regions, but a lot of these traditions that we have that are considered to be polite often have a hidden genesis. So I guess I wonder, do you think that the lack of a formal understanding for these ideas that makes a person polite give them more credibility? And if so, does the transition to civility also have to have an equally hidden origin in order for us to be widely accepting it as a culture?
It's such an interesting idea, because what I found is that civility, just kind of common decency, the stuff of helping us peacefully coexist, that is remarkably timeless across history and across culture. But politeness, on the other hand, tends to be highly changeable, both within a society and between cultures as well. I'll give you an example. The pineapple, love it, like the symbol of luxury, hospitality, it's delicious. It's $1.99 at Costco. It was not always so ubiquitous. We take it for granted today, but the pineapple used to be for about a few decade period in England, 18th century England. It was the pinnacle of status and luxury. And only the uber elite could afford to have a pineapple and then display it on their dinner table and invite all their friends over and impress them with the fact they had this unobtainable luxury consumption good. And I mean, the pineapple in its heyday cost $50,000. It was just this extravagant luxury consumption good. That is until some enterprising merchants found a way to democratize the pineapple. People started importing them en masse. They even experimented with greenhouses in England and growing pineapples in England. People started renting out pineapples. All of a sudden, you could rent a pineapple for the night, have a lavish dinner party, impress your guests, and then send it back the next day. The original Rent the Runway. And once the pineapple was democratized, once everyone had access to it, the elites were like, well, this doesn't convey status anymore. And so they abandoned the pineapple rapidly and found a new luxury status and consumption good. But that's a great example. Things like taste and manners and etiquette, they all go hand in hand. And they often are a way for elites and in-group to define themselves against non-elite and out-group, both within a culture, like a stratified class, but also between cultures as well. I'll give you another example. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they were people who were very happy to see themselves as superior in every way, and anyone who was not Greek and not them was inferior and a barbarian. Anyone who didn't speak Greek, it sounded to Greek ears like they said bar, 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 and so therefore they were just barbarians. Like if you were not a Greek, you were either Greek and sophisticated or a barbarian. And they did this with everyone. They were if you were not Greek, you were not just culturally inferior, you were morally, intellectually inferior as well. But with the Macedons, Philip of Macedon, they're ethnically Greek, and yet the Greeks told themselves this story of superiority, like, the Greeks, we recline as we eat, the Macedons sit up. We, in ancient Greece, cut our wine with salt water, which is the way to do it. The Macedons don't, peasants. And all these different norms and the way they ate, the way they lived their lives, like, they couldn't just leave it as, we do it one way, you do it your way. It's just differently than that. They had to spin it into a story of superiority as well. And that's often how it is. I'll give you one last example. After the Civil War in America, it was a time of instability and chaos, like legally, but also socially. And there was a lot of social mobility during the Gilded Age. The robber barons, and all of a sudden, the old money in America were worried, how are we going to differentiate ourselves from the new money? And so they created these increasingly elaborate codes of etiquette in order that only they knew, in order to differentiate themselves from the new money, the parvenus. And one holdover from this era of history is the rule. Has anyone heard the rule, don't wear white after Labor Day? You can see me, I wear white all year round. I defy that rule. But, in this specific era, if you were caught wearing white after Labor Day, that was a sign that you were not in the know. You outed yourself as an outsider and a parvenu. And these are just a few of countless examples of the changeability of tastes, of manners, of etiquette, of social norms, all of which are to show a purpose. They're to the end of defining in-group, out-group, us versus them. Whereas the principles of civility, of sacrifice, of just how to do life together, those are remarkably constant. They stand the test of time across history and across culture.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, right here.
So while researching for this book, did you observe any power dynamics such as hierarchies that influence expectations that we have in civility today?
So your question is the use of civility and power, essentially? Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's the question that is often levied against civility, right? That it's a tool of oppressing, of silencing and oppressing the powerless. And what I enjoyed learning, is about how civility has been this tool of justice and equity in our world. I have a whole chapter in my book on civil disobedience, which is a vibrant part of the tradition of civility. That it's not incompatible, it is absolutely coherent with civility. I talk about Henry David Thoreau, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, William Wilberforce, and I show how they were not wilting violets. They cared passionately about the project of seeing equal recognition of people under the law. And they spoke truths to power. They took action. They were unequivocally empowered by their values of equal human dignity. I love to talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I had the privilege of just last week, I spoke at the Alabama Supreme Court, just in Montgomery, just right next door to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, where he preached about these ideas, civil disobedience as a duty of citizenship, as a duty of Christians who were thrown to the lions. He talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who defied the powers of the day and risked their lives to do so as well. And I was just a stone's throw away from where Rosa Parks refused to sit at the back of the bus and was kicked off and subsequently arrested for breaking the law, intentionally breaking the law, in order to illuminate a higher law, which is equal human dignity, even though that positive law was not codified, it did not respect equal human dignity, that she broke it in order to illuminate a higher law, a more noble, more just law. And Dr. King, for anyone who wanted to be part of his movement of nonviolent, peaceful resistance, he had them undergo a rigorous training that, in a sense, cultivated the disposition of civility. He ensured that all who were part of his team and part of his movement cultivated a love and respect for the people they were protesting before they protested, before he allowed them to. They weren't going out angry and vicious and just wanting to vent their spleen. That actually, once they cultivated that love and respect, that love and respect informed and compelled their action. The letter writing campaigns, the sit-ins, the marches, the other activities that they did. And yet, at the same time that it compelled it, it also took certain options off the table. Dr. King, Gandhi, the abolitionists I mentioned, they knew that they could not, in the name of pursuing equal human dignity under the law and respecting the law, they could not dehumanize others, instrumentalize them, see them as just pawns in their way of achieving their greater good. They couldn't do that. That undermined everything they stood for. Gandhi says, we often hear that means don't matter, but in fact, he says, means are everything, are everything. And so, contrary to people saying that, civility and politeness are tools of the patriarchy, tools of white supremacists, tools of the people in positions of power to keep the power powerless. Again, they're often conflating civility and politeness and misunderstanding the tradition and power of true civility. And they miss how civility has been used by people across history and culture to create a more just and free world. And it has been a tool of the powerless to speak truth to the powerful in important and efficacious ways that have made our world a more just place. And it can be a tool for us in that way today, too. Thank you guys so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.